Hello everyone. Today I'd like to return to commentary mode. I've done various types of videos, but I want to go back to discussing a particular idea or a proposal. And I'm actually going to scooch a bit, this way, because I'm going to have, hopefully I'm going to learn some video editing and actually add some elements into my videos for once. So hoping to be able to put some things here, at least in the early part of the video. So the idea I wanted to talk about today was the proposal that's starting to do the rounds in the classics community, especially in the US. And this is the idea that the two traditional languages, the so-called classical languages, should no longer be required for entry to PhD programs, or maybe DPhil programs, whatever you want to call them, doctoral programs. I think this is mainly a US debate at the moment, but I did do my own PhD at Stanford. I had a great time. I do have a lot of affection for various aspects of US classics, so I have some argument, some reason to be concerned with it. Besides this, I think this issue actually raises some really interesting questions to do with social justice, equality, opportunity, and so forth that are both, interesting in themselves and I think really important, and they touch on a lot of other questions that come up that are facing us today in academia, both in classics and beyond. As you'll see by the end, I'm ultimately going to be arguing I'm ultimately going to be saying that the thought of not having Greek and Latin as compulsory requirements for grad school doesn't make me cry, or it's not going to make me lose any sleep. However, I think that it makes sense to keep Latin and Greek achievement as one of the main criteria when you're assessing applicants to PhD programs. I think there are strong considerations to keep doing that, and sort of along the lines of the way we've been doing in the past. Okay, so I'm going to start with the two places that I've seen this argument made. I mean, it may have been made by other people, but two places where I met it, the argument that we should stop requiring Latin and Greek for PhD programs. So the first place is a blog post for the Society of Classical Studies website, written early last year by Joy Connolly. And this is entitled Working Towards a Just and Inclusive Future for Classics. And in this blog post, Professor Connolly argues as follows, and here I'm going to quote, when discussing application files, instead of asking how many years of Greek or Latin or Greek/Roman history/archaeology, how many years has the student taken, with all the attendant assumptions about commitment and seriousness these questions have historically entailed, ask instead, says Joy Connolly, ask instead, what does the student bring to the field that is new and that enhances our collective study and research, as well as the classroom experience of our undergraduates, whom this student will teach? So that's the question she's advising faculty members who are looking at graduate applications to ask, rather than the traditional ones, about Greek and Latin training. Okay, then she goes on. Classical studies will not thrive if it welcomes to graduate school only students who, through luck or privilege or both, have had access to Greek and Latin in college, let alone high school. And she goes on to recommend that classes ask their deans to put aside some money so that classics PhD students who haven't had the opportunity of learning the languages before can go on summer courses and brush up, go to sort of boot camps in these languages. And she also makes the suggestion that instead of having faculty members from other universities fly in and give talks, you should just do the talks over Zoom, and you can save the money you ordinarily would have spent on transportation and accommodation for talks. You could spend that money supporting graduate students to learn the languages in this way. Of course, there has kind of been an uptick in Zoom talks this year, as you may have noticed. But it's not quite what Joy Connolly had in mind here, I don't think. Okay, so the second place that I've seen this argument made that we should stop requiring Greek and Latin for PhD applicants is in Walter Scheidel's keynote at the annual meeting of the US Association of Ancient Historians, a lecture which was actually done on Zoom, obviously in this case for COVID-related reasons, and which was then shared online where I was able to see it. So Scheidel is arguing that ancient history should move away from classics as a field, among other things. And he goes on to say that the traditional approach, the traditional sort of classic-centric approach, raises serious concerns about social justice. That's a quotation. And he goes on, he says, We're being reminded with increasing frequency that preparation in the canonical languages serves as a means of gatekeeping that works against students from less privileged backgrounds. Ancient history, this is still Scheidel, ancient history can never hope to become truly inclusive in a classics context for that reason alone. And Scheidel also suggests that we should put as much emphasis on a thorough archaeological training as we always have on thorough linguistic training, thorough training in languages. And actually, I'm very happy to agree with this last point. I had a tiny taste of archaeological training when I was at grad school. I would have loved to have had more, not just because the small bit of digging that I was able to do was tremendously interesting, but because I do agree with Scheidel that the archaeological record is at least as vital an entry point, is at least as important a source of evidence for the ancient world as literary texts are. However, I'd also like to flag a couple of phrases that I would question in what Connolly and Scheidel have had to say here. So when Connolly refers to students who, through luck or privilege or both, have had access to Greek and Latin in college and at secondary school, it might be that she's leaving out some other factors. I just want to raise that possibility for the moment. Other factors that may also contribute to someone getting to the end of their undergraduate career with a good level of Greek and Latin. And when Scheidel talks about gatekeeping, we might bear in mind that gatekeeping is necessarily what classics departments and all academic departments have to do as long as they're in a situation that there are more people applying to grad school than they have places for. That's just a necessary thing that you have to do when you're selecting people, when the demand outstrips the places that you actually have. So the question really is not whether they're going to do gatekeeping. The question is what kind of gatekeeping that they do or we do, and what the criteria for that gatekeeping, what the criteria along which we select people basically are. And I think Scheidel recognizes this, but it's something that we're going to come back to, and we'll also come back to what Connolly may be leaving out of the equation when it comes to the level of achievement people have in Latin and Greek when they finish their BAs. For now, though, I actually want to go further into this point Scheidel made about gatekeeping. So the reason I think he knows that it's what kind of gatekeeping that we have that's at stake here, not whether gatekeeping is going to take place at all, is, well, first of all, because it's a pretty obvious point, and Walter's a pretty smart guy. But also there are other remarks in his talk that make that pretty clear. So, for example, he says that even though his ancient languages aren't very strong, he hasn't made such a bad ancient historian. There he's being a bit modest because he's actually, obviously a very distinguished ancient historian. But anyway, it's clear that what he's talking about really is how important language skills are to making good ancient historians, how powerfully the language skills predict someone who's going to be able to contribute to the field in a substantive way. Now, Scheidel is someone who, by his own admission, sees himself first and foremost as a historian. And his remarks actually come from a lecture to a society of ancient historians, right? Not classicists. So I think that makes it relatively easy to make the argument that languages are not that important. When it comes to ancient historians, actually, I would even agree that language skills are not everything. They can be overemphasized, and I think they have been overemphasized in the past. You can contribute a lot to our knowledge about ancient Greece and Rome without having a perfect grasp of your principal parts or always knowing where to put your accents in Greek. And that point seems even more secure when we're talking about archaeologists. You can obviously contribute to archaeology without being amazing at ancient philology. However, if we move to other areas of inquiry that have traditionally been bound up with classics, things get a bit more difficult. The argument becomes a bit less convincing. So someone who wants to advance our knowledge of ancient philosophy is probably going to have a hard time doing it if they can't read Plato or Aristotle or whatever philosophical text they're concerned with in Greek. And once we get to philology, philology either in the traditional UK meaning of linguistics, or the linguistic study of Greek and Latin, or in the US meaning as scholarship on ancient Greek and Roman literature, once we get to philology, it's very, very difficult to make the argument that you don't need Greek and Latin at an advanced level if you're going to make a serious contribution to the field. It's just hard to see how that could happen without you having advanced language skills, right? But it's not just a matter of who's going to get above that bar of publishing peer-reviewed articles or work that makes a significant contribution. In most cases, you don't know that for sure when people are applying to PhD programs anyway. It also seems like a fair assumption that people who know Greek and or Latin better when they apply to grad school are, on the whole, going to have a better understanding of Greek and Roman society, and are going to do better as teachers and researchers in Greek and Roman culture. So that's a key point, and I'm saying that on the whole. Now, as we've seen, a good grasp of Greek and Latin is a necessary condition for good work on ancient Greece and Rome. It's not that if you don't have a perfect grasp of Greek and Latin, you can't contribute. But across all the different types of work on these cultures, philological, archaeological, philosophical, it stands to reason that there'll be some kind of correlation between having put a lot of time into learning Greek and Latin, having spent a lot of time with ancient texts, and being a good and a competent Hellenist and or Romanist. And it's true that, and while it's true that some people who start the languages late catch up and even overtake people who've been doing them for a longer time. I mean, I know this experience because I've had a lot of people who've taken the languages less for less time than me overtake me. So that's obviously something that happens. On the whole, studying the languages for longer, reading more texts, seems to make people better at them, and it gives you more experience and knowledge of the ancient world. And if we didn't believe that as classicists, then it becomes quite hard to say what we think we're doing when we teach undergraduates in Greek and Latin, and what we think we're doing when we're encouraging them to take these classes. If we don't make the assumption that taking Greek and Latin classes will give you a certain type of intimate knowledge of the Greek and Roman worlds that you wouldn't have gotten in any other way. And this brings us to a separate point, and one of the points I'll make in this that I'd like to emphasize the most. And this is that when choosing candidates for PhDs, as with other selection processes, though you might be concerned with social justice, you might be very concerned with social justice, however you define it, there are also other things you might want to be paying attention to. One of them is skills or competence or the ability to do a good job in whatever field we're talking about. Being competent at reading Greek and Latin obviously isn't as crucial as being competent at building bridges if you're a civil engineer, or at certain types of medical procedure if you're training to be a doctor. However, if we think that getting the facts straight about the ancient world and opening a doorway into the ancient world, if we think that these things are important at all, then we should also think it's important to have skills, the kind of skills that allow us to do that effectively. And then it would also make sense to give those kinds of skills a certain weighting when people are applying to grad school, where they're going to become professionals in the ancient Mediterranean world. And, again, I think the assumption that people who have put more time and effort into their languages will, on the whole, be more knowledgeable about Greek and Roman culture, that assumption seems like a very difficult one to knock down or to doubt. Now, another thing we might want to take into account in grad school admissions is the things people have chosen to study in the past and the subjects they've chosen to study their time on. It doesn't mean that we should only let people into grad school in a subject if they've been studying it as long as it's possible to do so, or that we should make the amount of time they studied it the exclusive criterion for entry, or even the overriding one. It's not like you just get into grad school if you spent more time than the other person studying the languages. But it's worth bearing in mind that even in environments in which Greek and Latin are offered, which does include a fair number of universities across the West and beyond, even in those environments, it's not all students who choose to study Latin and Greek. It's a minority. And when they do choose to study these subjects, they do so largely in an awareness that this is going to be slightly risky. At least it's not going to make them a lot of money. It's not necessarily going to get them a secure, well-paying job on its own. I mean, I don't actually think it's going to be very harmful. But it's clear that you could choose other things. You could choose the time that you could choose to spend the time that you spend studying Greek on something else that maybe is equally difficult or has a similar level of difficulty computer science or biochemistry, and that may have more financial rewards in the long run. It's likely that it will. So the people who are self-selecting into these courses are usually doing it out of passion, and they're doing it usually with a sense that there are opportunity costs, right? What economists would call opportunity costs. They're foregoing other opportunities by spending time on their Greek and their Latin. And this brings us to a final thing we might want to take into account in awarding places in PhD programs. And this is what we would call, or might call, merit. It's kind of mysterious exactly what we mean by merit, but I guess it's some kind of combination of hard work and natural talent. There are, of course, things in life, basic human rights say, that we don't want to distribute on the basis of merit. You get human rights whether or not you're good at something. But that doesn't seem to be the case with entry into grad school. That doesn't fall into that same category of everybody just gets it. So one way of looking at this is to think about someone who enters college, chooses all the Latin and Greek courses they can, works really hard at their languages, which, as some of you probably know, are very hard in themselves. Then this person also, in the process, turns down opportunities to study engineering or whatever it is, and then they apply to grad school. Now, it's hard to see what that person has done wrong, right? It's hard to see what they've done wrong in playing the hand they've been dealt. And that ultimately is all any of us can do. So I guess I wonder to what extent it chimes with our moral intuitions to then not give that achievement some pretty strong weighting in applications to grad school, in competitive applications to grad school. Which is to say, really, that I think there's a pretty strong social justice case here, but just not quite the one that Professor Connolly is making, Professor Connolly and others. That's not to say that I think the things that she is talking about don't have any weight. I'm just trying to argue that there are other things here, too, that we should pay attention to. And not just things that don't have anything to do with justice, but also other claims on our sense of justice. So there is, for example, a certain fairness, I think most people would agree, in rewarding people for things they've chosen to work towards and that they've spent a long time doing, they've spent a lot of time and effort in. Now, when Connolly, Scheidel, and others talk about social justice in this context, as I say, they're appealing to different things. They seem to be appealing especially to the fact that not everyone has the same chance to spend time on their Latin and Greek. And that is undoubtedly true. Only a small minority of secondary schools in the English-speaking world offer Latin, and even fewer Greek. In fact, in New Zealand, I think there are no secondary schools that offer Greek at all. Though it's also worth bearing in mind, by the way, that in the continental European context, there are considerably more Germans and Italians who have access to these languages at school through their country's state education systems. But anyway, what I wanted to say about this point, and it'll actually be the final substantive thing that I say today, is that, like a lot of arguments that depend on the idea that people haven't had the opportunity to do X, it's stronger the shorter the period we're talking about is, and the younger the people that we're talking about. So if we're talking about secondary schools, it seems pretty clear to me that some people just won't have had the chance to study Greek and Latin at school. By the time that they're 18, they won't have had the chance. Probably has something to do with the way that, when you go to school, you don't choose the secondary school you go to, or you don't quite choose all the courses in the way that you choose your college and the way that you might choose your major at college, right? By the time you're 18, you have a lot more freedom than when you're going into secondary school. So I think that, the idea that someone, when they apply to an undergraduate program, hasn't had the opportunity of studying Latin and Greek, that makes perfect sense to me. That's why, of course, at Oxford, they don't require Latin and Greek for the classics course. There are various options. You can also go into a part of the course where you learn one or both of the classical languages when you're there. However, when we're talking about graduate admissions, I think the argument becomes slightly less convincing, because Latin and Greek is offered at various colleges. A lot of universities offer it, and even if you miss out at undergraduate level, there are postbacks, and this is actually a fairly common way that people prepare for graduate school in the States. So I think expecting candidates to find their way towards some some of the requisite training, or I should say some of the training for the field, find their own way towards building up some of the skills that are associated with the field. That's something that virtually all postgraduate programs do in other disciplines, and it's for obvious reasons, right? Because once someone is on a PhD program, there's only a certain amount of time. You can't teach them everything from scratch at that point. So it makes sense to get them to meet you halfway and to learn the basics by the time that they apply. Okay, so to sum up, I think the proposal not to require Greek and Latin for application to PhD programs is an interesting one, and I'm not totally against it. Actually, I'm not totally against removing it as a requirement, as a sine qua non, I suppose I could say, using Latin. But I think it still makes sense to weight it, to have it as one of the criteria that PhD programs look at, and I think it should also be weighted reasonably heavy. Latin and Greek may not make you automatically, or may not automatically make you able to do good work in the field, and not being great at languages definitely doesn't mean you won't be a good ancient historian. But on the whole, it seems a fair assumption that people who've spent more time with Greek and Roman texts will have a more intimate knowledge of Greek and Roman culture in a way that's especially important, I think, for philologists, for philosophers, anyone working with texts. And that field-specific knowledge or competence is something that seems reasonable to bear in mind in grad school applications, as are the choices that people make and the effort that they put in to learning about the ancient Mediterranean world. It's true that some people just won't have had the chance to learn Greek and Latin by the beginning of their undergraduate degree, but by the time they apply for grad school, I think that argument is weaker, and it does seem that they will have had enough opportunity to learn Greek and Latin, and I think it's fair to expect them to work some of the way towards gaining an advanced knowledge of these languages by the time that they apply for grad school. Okay, so that's all I wanted to say, and I'd be really interested to hearing what other people think, and if you have thoughts, then please just write them in the comments below. So thanks.